Wendy, it's been so long.
Oh my God! Holy cow! Are we going to have a show band soon?
Yeah, I think
that was awesome. Let's give it up to Kelsey and Anna. They just keep hitting it out of the park. I know it's been so long. I've missed you. And the other thing I want to say about our producers is they're very strategic about when they turn my mic off and not. And I love it. Like I get these things that says everyone can see and hear you, and your mic is off. I want that to just follow me everywhere I go. I think I'll be a lot more successful in life if people do that.
I need that sort of management for my wall-to-wall Zoom meetings these days, and maybe I'll suck less in them.
Honest to God. Well, I know that we have two amazing guests, one who's returned from a previous life with us.
From our debut episode.
Oh, yeah. And then a new guest. And we have lots to talk about, so we don't want to belabor anything. But I did want to say congratulations on your high school graduate. I don't know that I've seen you since he officially graduated. That's a really big deal.
They have officially graduated. It's a really big deal. And maybe on Getting Real, like after dark, we'll have a lengthy discussion of heteronormativity in private school graduations and just how queerness is not allowed there and how that went down for us. But
wow,
as it may.
Well, and I referred to your son as he, and I apologize.
Totally cool.
I'm still getting used to pronouns, so forgive me.
Sing it, so am I. I find myself correcting myself at least once a day with them, and they are very awesome and are extending grace to me and are like, it's been 18 years that you've been dealing with me, so it's going to take you a little while to like deprogram and get used to it. But it is you don't realize how much of language and linguistic construction is predicated upon gender norms until you have to start dismantling that. And so many of the things we take for granted in turns of phrase and how we say things and word choice and assumptions of what the story is behind something, it's all rooted in this one viewpoint of gender, which mercifully is changing and loosening up these days. So I think that's a great opportunity to bring our guests in.
I agree. Happy Pride Month to everyone. And let's welcome our guests.
Bring on the Sarah and the Cathy. Woohoo!
Yay!
Hello.
Hi, guys.
Cathy, can I toss it to you to introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm Cathy Hamaker, and I'm an independent museum consultant in Indianapolis, Indiana. I do exhibit and content development, and I worked for the Children's Museum in Indianapolis for 12 years, I think, before going rogue. Yeah, that's me.
And the fantabulous Sarah Cole is back. Sarah, can you introduce yourself for any new listeners?
Hi, I'm Sarah Cole. I am the CEO of the Glazer Children's Museum here in Tampa, Florida. And yeah, just super excited to be on. And Cathy and I go way back, so this will be fun.
Yeah, awesome. Also, I feel like in the interests of transparency and full disclosure, I should say that the three of us have played assassins together, and Sarah is absolutely deadly.
I was deadly one time. It was
That's all it
epic.
takes,
But
sir.
like, I feel like
Thanks.
the legend is a little much. I don't think I could pull it off again.
You were ruthless and efficient. So
I may have actually killed myself just to.
I was young and
Could you not handle the pressure, Cathy?
Mhm.
Yeah, sometimes
Exactly.
isn't it funny how sometimes in games you're just like you purposely screw up because you just can't deal with the pressure anymore.
Yep.
I get it. So full disclosure to our listeners and our watchers, I unfortunately was unable to attend our pre-show meeting. And so I'm meeting Cathy along with you all for the first time as well. And so if I say anything stupid, ask stupid questions, I apologize ahead of time. I'm taking this ride with everyone else.
I'm not worried.
totally cool.
Thank you.
Where do we want to dive in? There's so much to talk about. The topic of queerness in museums. There's queerness back of house. There's the queerness that we don't admit to front of house.
So can I start with a question?
Sure.
Because when I got brought up to speed by our producers extraordinaire, they had mentioned a story, I believe, Cathy, you shared it regarding a mummy. Was it a mummy?
No.
And
Yes.
and I was explaining it in lack of complete detail to my husband, and he had follow-up questions. It sounded fascinating. So can I ask you about that?
Actually, I'll kick it to Sarah because that happened right when I had just joined the Children's Museum. And so I am probably not completely in the know.
Well, and I will say, so this was this weird, like, yeah, it was a very weird transition time. I don't think I was actually, I think it was, I had just left. So we were in that weird little crossover space. But anyway, so the museum had a mummy on loan from another museum for decades upon decades upon decades, right? One of these like loans that's pretty much a permanent loan, but not entirely. And a lot of times, you know, as part of the research into the mummy, they got with the local, you know, with the medical, you know, with the hospital, and they did a CT scan, or was it a CT scan? Must have been. I don't know.
Yes.
And
CT.
this was something that had been displayed. It wasn't like in the
it had been on display in the museum forever. There's actually a book that is considered one of the definitive histories of the Children's Museum of Indianapolis, and the title is "Take Care of That Mummy." So the mummy is integral to the history of the museum. And
yeah, it had been there at least since I was a child when they built the new building in '76.
Yeah,
and I remember seeing it when Indianapolis was, I think, AAM, the American Alliance of Museums conference, and I was a baby museum person.
I remember seeing it as a child in like you know, early '80s kind of thing. So yeah, it's been there for a long time. So mummy had been there for a while. They finally, you know, decided they were going to do a scan, see what was inside the sarcophagus, take a look at the skeletal structure, all of these things. So the mummy was, you know, the name of the mummy is Wendy. Apologies, I have a friend in the room with me right now. So Wendy was this, you know, amazing mummy. We had this beautiful recreation of this, you know, woman with, you know, long hair and all of these things. And so, you know, so she's been on display. They do the scan and determine, based on the pelvis and some other things, that Wendy was likely biologically male, so biologically assigned male at birth. And at the time, kind of didn't do a whole lot with that. But, you know, internally, there were some really interesting discussions about, you know, like, how do we talk about this, you know, because again, you know, there was maybe it was, you know, a different body that was put in the grave and it didn't match up. Maybe it was this, maybe
so the sarcophagus was every external
everything
adornment was male.
And I think the name is a feminine form name.
Yes. Absolutely. And this was a woman of high class, right? So this was, you know, not necessarily like a princess, I guess, Hey, buddy.
I did a lot of bad stuff.
Okay, you need to go back now.
No.
Oh, that's motherhood for you.
Right on. Well, to continue the story, there were a lot of sort of questions about what do we need to do with the display, because the display was very heavily feminized. Like, we had a mannequin of her in, with, a hand mirror, like doing her hair and the kohl on the eye and things like that. And so then the question was, what do we do with this? And I was not party to any of the discussions, Sarah. I don't know if you were. That was not.
I was not. So at that point, I had left the museum at that point. So I was not party to any of the discussions about what was going on there. I also know about that time was when the Oriental Institute was kind of recalling their loan and bringing her back.
Approximately when was this? What year?
2010?
Yeah, it would have been.
So not that long ago. Well, I guess.
Yeah, I think it was 2010, and we had planned to redo that gallery anyway, and so I think there was probably a certain amount of relief of, well, now we don't have to suddenly explain why Hotep's pronouns have changed, or it was just send the mummy back to the Oriental Institute. But yeah, it was an interesting sort of additional layer of, we're not just talking about this mummy in the context of a label that refers to it as he or she. They had built a whole sort of display around the idea of Egyptian womanhood that then either would have to be unpicked or re-explained, or who knows.
And Cathy, you bring up something fascinating, which I didn't think of when we did our pre-prep meeting. Yeah, it would have been like, it was oh, thank God we don't need to deal with this. The Fields did that really publicly with Sue the T-Rex.
Yes.
Where it was that big thing on social media, and they pushed a lot of it through the Sue the T-Rex Twitter account.
What was that?
My pronouns are they, them. My name is Sue because of this thing, because of who discovered me, and I'm named in honor of that, but that doesn't mean I'm female. We can't tell. And they leaned hard into the science, but that's
that's interesting.
It was like 9 years after the mummy.
I've forgotten about that, but that was really handled, I thought, very well, considering that they had already given this very big social media presence to Sue. That, of course, Sue is going to claim their own pronouns. Boom,
So Sue, forgive me. So Sue, I'm from Chicago, so I have a fondness for Sue, and I always assumed Sue was a female dinosaur. So you're saying, did they know that immediately, that they couldn't determine the gender of the dinosaur? Or?
Yeah. So Sue was named for the woman that found the dinosaur. So the name Sue came from the woman who found the dinosaur. I think there was an original assumption that potentially, again, pelvic bones, always our favorite thing, may have meant that it was a female dinosaur, but they later determined that they can't really tell. And so, yeah, I just looked at the date on that. So again, that was 2017. And I think that just says so much about the rapid move of how quickly we've moved through, kind of the normalization in a lot of spaces of, hey, let's make sure we're having that level of representation. I mean, it was huge, right? I mean, what a moment of representation to have the world's most famous dinosaur using they, them pronouns.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. It's cool. I've had this conversation just the last couple of days. I won't identify who, but in my family, there's been some generational arguing regarding cancel culture and things like that. And it's interesting because my son and I had this kind of conversation about the generation gap and how it exists in every generation, but why it feels so much different than this generation. And I like, we were talking about the 1960s and 70s, and it was the war. It feels like the generation gap today has so much to do with demographics, race, gender, that it feels this generation gap isn't just about generation gap, but it's about people feeling threatened about the change in their power, in their place in society. Whereas if you're protesting a war, that doesn't necessarily threaten your sense of security within society, right? It's a pacifist versus a more, or music or whatever the hell the generational gaps have been. This current generation gap seems very seismic in terms of people's sense of where they are in the power structure in society, both gender lines and race lines. And I think that's it was an interesting conversation for me, because, not to get too political, but it really feels historic that we're dealing in this country with a time when women and people who identify differently and people of color are becoming more of the majority as opposed to minority, more out, and what that does to the power structure of how this country was established and built. Yeah. And how fast it's going. To your point, Sarah, how fast these changes are.
I think a lot about, Cathy and I, we both worked in children's museums, right? And so our experiences with, little dudes, and I have little dudes of my own. And, I was thinking about this the other day, so I picked Betty up from camp today, right? So she's at a Y camp, YMCA, not traditionally known for their super progressive stances on things, songs, none notwithstanding. The entire camp staff today was wearing shirts that say "For All" in rainbow and trans flag lettering, right? So they were the entire staff was wearing pride shirts today for the last day of June. And half of the kids, and Betty rolls up and she goes, "Oh, I forgot it was the last day of June. I should have worn my mom's shirt today. I should have worn my pride shirt today." And half of her little friends at camp are like sad that they didn't wear their pride shirts today. And I was like, all of these little dudes, like, this is not outside. This is not different. This is not new. This is just part of their world and part of their, just their existence. And so it is really interesting to be in a space where, having gone through the "no, you can't sell memberships at Pride because what would people think," to fly in progress flags at every museum out there, right? And so it's just, I think it feels fast, but at the same time, when you think about the fact that, these young children are kind of leading this in a lot of ways, they're super flexible. They're fine. They're good to go.
So what's your view within the museum programming community, recognizing that, so again, I'm not in your world, so correct me if I'm wrong, but I would imagine that there's a disparity between the decision makers and where they're at age-wise, and funders, and then your audience members who are younger, right? How are you guys navigating? Well, first of all, is there a divide internally regarding programming and the appropriateness of programming and whatnot? And then, assuming there is even a modicum of divide, how are you guys navigating that when you have a younger audience, but you have older people making certain decisions?
Please excuse me while I drain the rest of this beer in order to fill that question.
Cathy, you want to jump in on that one?
Well, I don't often deal directly with funders, of course. So which I do agree is that is a big generational gap. Is the money is still coming from, correct me if I'm wrong, Sarah, but the money is still coming from the next level up.
So I would say I think that is absolutely the conventional wisdom, but I have not seen that play out, at least not recently. I think what's been really telling, in a lot of ways, we've seen a major shift with most of our funders, especially corporate funders and foundations, in the last year and a half around social justice and really looking specifically at racial justice, but also really looking at representation. So for example, I just filled out and I won't name the, I don't know if I should name, I just filled out a grant application, and they actually asked the questions of how many people on your leadership staff how many BIPOC members of your leadership staff? Does your CEO identify as BIPOC, queer, neurodivergent, and so like really digging into understanding the diversity of the staff and of the board. These are not questions that normally go on a grant application. And so it's really, to me, that's a major tell of funders are really invested in diversity in really interesting ways. And so, I actually haven't seen that play out. I've seen more of our donors coming to the table saying, what more can we do? How can we make sure that kids who are growing up feeling like they're not being seen, how can we make sure that they feel safe, that they feel like, their families are being seen?
I can hop in a little bit on this one just because I am in a position where, in a different sort of realm, but like Sarah, I'm interfacing with C-suite and boards and helping C-suite work with their boards. Yes, absolutely what Sarah said about the sort of the conventional wisdom of the big bucks are still coming from, and yes, boards are still chock full of folks, a generation or two older, with wealth that was accumulated in more traditional ways. But number one, we're seeing a lot of energy around changing boards, not just in terms of who's on the board, but what does it take to get on the board? That pay to play to be on a board is a huge impediment. And the whole social fabric of, well, my wife was on a gala committee with his wife, he'd be great to get on the board, which is stupendously heteronormative. We're seeing some of that really start to recede. There's great research out of Canada on the changing face of philanthropy, and philanthropy from historically marginalized and unincluded populations, from BIPOC, from LGBTQIA, from Indigenous groups, and that those groups give and those individuals give very, very differently than traditional wealth-focused, I'm an old white person on the board. And the more that we diversify boards, the more we're driving that kind of philanthropy, as opposed to chasing the $120 million gift from the wealthy white couple that wants their name on the building, sort of thing. So we're seeing a real shift there. We're seeing a shift, like Sarah said, in what people are asking for on grant applications. I'm seeing it on sponsorships, that companies who want to give sponsorship dollars, whether it's to a cultural event or attraction or something else, are asking really pointed questions, not only about audience, but about the organization that they'd be giving those sponsorship dollars to as well. And that's radically different. They want to know that they're getting reach, and they want to know that that reach is valid and meaningful and data-driven. It's not enough to put up an aphorism for Black Lives Matter on your Instagram or slap a rainbow flag across the columns at the front of your building. Performative wokeness is no longer cutting it for institutions, and donors are really starting to hold them accountable for that.
So it's weird. I'm wondering if you guys are hearing any of this. My husband, I just overheard him today. Cathy, my husband's a professor, just to give you a little background. And I overheard him talking about, and don't quote me on this, but there's something is going on politically where there's certain universities that are asking academics to basically give out their political leanings or something. Have you heard about this?
Florida, yeah. So that just happened in my state. Yes. So that is what's going forth now, is that all the public universities will be doing I'm going to try and be really careful about this and in the middle because I haven't read the actual, details of the bill. But my understanding is they will be surveying students and faculty at all public universities, and to make sure there is an appropriate mix of ideas in the university space. It sounds terrifying to me. This does not sound okay. And, a lot of people I know within the university system are, I think, rightfully concerned. It also does not feel like this would pass any sort of constitutional.
It will not.
Okay, so it's a proposed bill, but it hasn't been enacted.
Yeah, well, and I need to look. No, most of the bill, I need to double check. A lot of things go into effect tomorrow at the beginning of the kind of political year.
This is the correct
Yeah,
time.
we got our yokes. Our yikes. Oh my God.
Yeah. Oh my God. Yeah. Yeah. I was gonna say, yeah, that's the thing. So, Florida's had a great banner year for gay rights. We also, which does go into effect tomorrow, is the ban for transgender youth in sports, which is just, again, horrifying.
Y'all need a new governor.
So how does that bleed into, because maybe I'm being ignorant here, so forgive me, but when I think of museums, I tend to think of them as somewhat parallel, whatever, to universities and colleges and academic institutions. I see them as cooperative. So how does the notion that Florida has this zeitgeist that would even motivate a bill like this being proposed, do you feel that impacts potentially museum curriculum and whatnot? Like,
I didn't until just now.
Thanks, Wendy.
Sorry to terrify you.
It's absolutely possible. I would hope that we will be past that before. I hope that won't be an issue in the same way.
It's interesting, though, that it's happening in your state politically with respect to the academic institutions, yet you're not feeling it. You're not feeling it.
But I would also say, children's museums are really different, right? And so, while I think, museums like, the Field or, larger museums that are tied to universities in a deeper way that are at a different kind of academic sense, we're tied to the K through 12 system in that way, right? And so, if there was something deeply impacting the K through 12 system where I am, then absolutely that is something we would be keeping an eye on, right? And so, the youth athlete thing was something that we're really trying to keep an eye on. Obviously, we don't have like a museum sports team or anything like that, but the idea that trans kids are going to feel less safe in the next year is a space that we're really actively trying to make sure that we are showcasing, that we are a safe space for trans kids and for gender nonconforming kids, because, their individual schools are, a lot of them have teachers and coaches and people within their schools who are really, really supportive of them. But the larger educational system, the educational, laws have now put this in place that is it's a really harmful law in so many ways. And, it's a space that we have not actively advocated one way or another, again, because sports is just not one of those spaces that we've ever really played in, but in the sense of, kids are all welcome here, and making sure that we're showing representation of trans and non-binary people in our museum is really important.
So, sorry, Cynthia, go ahead.
To build on what Sarah's saying, number one, on a very granular level, we actually have an example in the past from when policy fundamentally affected what museums do and how they do it and what they're putting out there. And that was No Child Left Behind. When No Child Left Behind was instituted and districts across the country went to highly, highly content-driven, every 8th grader will be able to name the following types of rocks kind of education standards, as opposed to critical thinking skills and learning through inquiry and stuff like that, museums stepped into that fray. Museums stepped into the void of how do you get kids to engage with science, engage with English, engage with history in these more integrative, skill building kind of ways, as opposed, because K through 12 was mandated to, we are now going to turn children into walking world book encyclopedias about these very narrow bands of content, and museums really stepped into that. What I think we've been leading up to, and in a way what's transpired in Florida with the efforts to police thought in academe, because academe is too liberal, and I agree that it probably will not hold up to constitutional challenge, and I say that as the partner of someone who is a professor at a state university in Missouri, which, guess what, is going the way of Florida, so we're watching this real closely. Just as museums stepped into the fray in terms of critical thinking skills and things like that with No Child Left Behind, we've seen them stepping into the fray on social emotional. We've seen them stepping into the fray on representation, on doing the work internally. Not all museums, good Lord, not all museums, but doing the work internally to make sure that their front of house staff and their brand values and the way that they're expressing their vision and their mission are welcoming and inclusive, pointedly so, as other places are getting closed off to kids and young adults and are becoming less welcoming and less safe. And we're, in this house, we're a living example of how important that can be. My kid is queer. They have been out as bisexual since they were in 7th grade. They are non-binary and they use they, them pronouns now. We volunteered at the art museum in the days before the rabies. And we were volunteering there one time, and the security guard who was on duty at the special exhibit that we were handling ticket taking for, that guy was literally the first time my kids saw a femme-presenting gay man in the wild. Because Kansas, so, it's not like New York City. And it was the first time they saw somebody comfortable in their own skin, who had tailored the security guard uniform to within an inch of its freaking life, and rings and floral earrings, and, was fine. There were not torches and pitchforks, that you can be yourself and you can express yourself and be your authentic self, and it's okay. And the two of them got into one mother of a conversation, like, I'm going to be over here taking tickets and let you have your time. And it was earth-shattering for my kid, because it didn't matter how queer positive and welcoming and supportive household we were, and the books we read and the movies we watched and the things we discussed, had to see someone who was different, who was okay. And the museum was very intentional about letting its employees, he's not the only one, letting its employees be themselves within the confines of, you're a security guard and you have to wear this blazer. It's a really intentional choice that they've made. And it's huge. It makes that building a safe space for queer teens throughout the area.
I always tried very hard being sort of, gender fluid and fairly masculine in my dress. I would get kids, not super often, but often enough, asking, the littles asking me, are you a boy or a girl? And saying, and their parents would get mad that they had asked, right? Because the parents were pretty sure that I had boobs. So, but to turn to the kid and say, well, does it matter? And have them go, oh. And of course, at a certain age, it does matter to them. You can't get around that because they're about sorting things, right? They're sorting blocks, they're sorting colors, they're sorting genders. They'll figure out that there are gray areas later, but still, it certainly seemed to me to be important, even in a children's museum, to be representing that sort of gray area between, very clearly masculine and very clearly feminine. But, who knows if that actually made an impression on any actual kids, but we tried.
So Cathy, if I could get a little personal for a second.
Yeah.
What have you noticed? So you're hitting on something that's really, it like triggers me, because I honestly, it was traumatic for me. I was very late to develop, so much so that I was mistaken as a little boy up until I was about 15. And in my high school, where I did my freshman year, it was an H-shaped building. And in order to get from one side to the other, you had to go through either the top or the bottom hallway. And I had to purposely take a longer route to go on the top one, even if my classrooms were on the first floor, because the first floor had this hallway that was populated by jocks. And I would walk through when I started my freshman year, and they would say, these really mean boys would say, are you a dude or a chick? Like every day. And it's imprinted in me, because I was very late to develop. I still don't have much boobs. And so that's why
I didn't until COVID.
Pardon me?
I'm spare.
So what did you say, Cynthia?
Would you like some of mine?
Well, I when I do my refreshing, I'll call you.
Thanks.
Maybe you could send me some for part of my refreshing. But anyhow, thank God for push-up bras. But and so I'm curious if you've noticed a change over the years in terms of the way young people do interact with you and do respond to you and whatnot. Just in general, if you feel that the notion of boy versus girl and whatever that means, if you see that changing over time.
My general impression is that the majority of the public is still, they may be very encouraging when their kid is 5, 6, 7, starting to express their own opinions, but when their kid is 3 or 4, they're definitely still sorting it into, these are boys, these are girls, this is how mommy's body is different from daddy's body. I feel like the kids who usually would ask me about that were at that age where sorting things is something they do. So I don't feel like that's changed a lot, but that's just my experience.
Well, and I would say, that's developmentally appropriate, right? At a certain age, those young kids, being a queer couple living in a sex positive household with the whole, you don't know, genders change. We're reading stories about trans kids and doing all that. There is a level of, why does my body look different than my sister's body?
Yeah, I interrupt you for 1 second. What does sex positive mean?
Sex.
Sorry, I have to interrupt because I don't know what sex positive means.
So a lot of us grew up in, especially if we grew up in religious homes, homes where sexuality in general, whether you were heterosexual or homosexual, was something you didn't talk about. It was shamed. You were, purity culture, modesty culture, all of those sorts of things. And we've chosen to be a space where, bodies feel nice, and that's okay, but it's yours. And we've used it to teach consent. And we really talk about your body is your own. There are appropriate places and appropriate times, but I don't want my kids to grow up feeling scared of their bodies or scared of sex or scared of how their bodies are feeling. And I want them to be in a space where they trust us enough to ask us questions no matter what. And so that's really, for me, that's what being sex
Got
positive.
it. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, but I didn't know what that meant. So
no, absolutely.
Sorry. I hope you can remember where I interrupted you, because I interrupted.
Well, it's interesting, that you say that, and thank you, Wendy, for sharing that. As a person in a larger body, I had very much the opposite experience growing up. But I have a boy who is in a larger body who also doesn't like haircuts. So he has, you saw him earlier, long, luxurious, beautiful blonde hair and a curvier physique for a young man. And very often is mistaken for a girl, and very often being told, asked by children and adults. When we went to Disney World, no shade on Disney, but the number of people who referred to him as princess was a little much. And we had to be like, nope, this is Bobby. He's a boy, and it's like, but it's just, there is still really quick, signifiers. Hair length and body shape are like, those are the two things. If you've got long hair and anything up here, well, you must be a girl. And that's not true. There are plenty of men out there with breasts. There are plenty of cis men with breasts, much less trans men or non-binary folks.
I've told this story about when we were at Disney World and Sean was in a wheelchair because they had shattered their foot in multiple places. And it was when Sean was still identifying he, him, and I'm a boy, but had really long hair. And because cast members were unable to see the full clothing or get a really good read on the body, and the only signifier they had was the long hair and the fairly delicate features, Sean kept getting called princess. And it was like, so much gendered language in theme parks. So much gendered language. Oh my God.
We noticed a couple years ago, and it's gotten a lot better. I will say, our most recent trip has gotten a lot better. But I mean, probably 3 years ago, it was make it pink, make it blue. And I mean, there was a hard line down the middle of boy stuff, girl stuff. And it was, and maybe it was because I was like there with my kids or something. I hadn't noticed it to that level. I feel like it got really intense for a few years.
Yeah, it did. And as a sort of non-binary person, I noticed it and it made me very uncomfortable. And I love I love it. I love it, Sarah.
Yeah.
The whole
I was really uncomfortable too. Yeah.
Boggles me because as a kid, if somebody had said princess to me as a kid, I would have flipped out, man. That was absolutely the last thing I wanted to be as a kid.
Yeah.
So I'm Jewish, so when someone calls me a princess, I get really pissed.
But I think it's so, yes, absolutely on the pink blue push in theme parks. But I don't know if y'all are of the right era, but particularly, museums, they don't refresh their exhibits all the time. Permanent exhibits endure. And there was a period of time where I was like, for the love of crap, I can be a lady scientist and not be wearing a hot pink sweater and massive statement jewelry under my pristine white lab coat to indicate I am a scientist who's a lady. Like, oh, good God, y'all. Look me beyond photos representing the broader reality. Please don't wear hot pink sweaters under the white scientist. Representing the broader reality to educate and push back. That is a great question. Photos are actually a really big part of it. Because when you're in an exhibition, unless you're at a museum that's got like massive facilitation staff, photos and images of humans are how we tell the story of who is doing this work. What does a historian look like? What does a scientist look like? What does a doctor look like? ASTC, the Association of Science and Technology Centers, has a grant with the Leda Hall Philanthropy Foundation doing If Then on women and gender minority representations in museums. And they have actually made available a free photo set showing women and gender fluid, non-binary, trans, gender non-conforming individuals, BIPOC, different mobility disabilities, limb differences, you name it. They've developed a photo set showing, look, actual professionals doing actual professional stuff and looking like actual human beings while doing it, that museums can use free of charge in their exhibitions, in their media, in their programming, what have you. So the photo representation is actually really, really huge for museums and making that more equitable and more inclusive. But I'm going to leave it to Sarah and Cathy to talk about stuff beyond photos, because there are other things that museums can do.
Sure. I think thinking about our assumptions about how, not to again keep going back to children's museums, but it's easier for kids to get pigeonholed, I think. But to ensure that when you're creating interactives, when you're doing label writing, which is a lot of what I do, ensuring that you're not making basic assumptions that your reader for a particular type of interactive is a boy or is a girl or is something specific, right? If you can look at things like the what was it called, the thing the Exploratorium did, the EDGE study, where they looked at how kids identifying as girls behave in science museums and looked at kids who identify as boys behave in science museums, and just kind of thinking about the sort of social ways people interact in our museums and making sure that we're creating spaces that work for kids who want to stick with a big group of friends or kids who want to do stuff on their own, and kind of meeting everybody where they are as opposed to assuming things about how kids and by extension adults want to use our exhibits. We've actually done two now. The Children's Museum in Indianapolis has done two Barbie exhibits, one of which was while I was there. And there was a very concentrated effort to ensure that there were pictures of boys doing things in the exhibit and that it was not an exhibit for girls. But the problem, of course, is that the adults are busily gendering their children frequently, and they would tell, I don't know about you, Sarah, but I heard plenty of people say, that's not an exhibit for you. Yeah. That's a girl exhibit. 100%. And then when I did a Hot Wheels exhibit,
that's a boy.
Years later, what's gendered about cars, for God's sake? And yet there was this assumption that that's a boy exhibit. And I don't think it was quite as hard line as the Barbie exhibit, but even with our best efforts to kind of de-gender Barbie or de-gender Hot Wheels, you still are kind of fighting a cultural tide of what their parents are telling them.
No, absolutely. I remember in Barbie very clearly, making very pointed efforts, not to have like the boy activity, but to make sure that, masculine children and feminine children both felt welcome at all areas within the exhibit, right? There were boas and there were tuxedo jackets. There was this and there was this. And it wasn't boy clothes and girl clothes. We really tried to make that as inclusive as possible. And, I think for those kids who were able to get there, whose families let them get there, as many times as I saw, don't go in there, that's a girls exhibit, I also saw
boys and boas
and, masculine looking children in tutus and tiaras walking a runway and playing with gender in a way that children are supposed to. Children are actually supposed to have these moments where they're playing with gender because it's how they're figuring themselves out in so many ways. It's, it's funny when you were talking about, Cathy, about the, making sure that, what you're writing and what you're creating isn't, if you're writing something about trucks, that you're not writing it with a boy in mind. I think much like when we say museums are not neutral and we think about, colonialism, we think about race, a lot of times museums, we like to believe that when we're writing from a genderless space and we're creating things from a genderless moment, but we're not, right? So when we're doing a fashion exhibit, we have an audience in mind. Who is that audience and how are we making sure that we're trying to reconcile ourselves?
Yeah, it definitely, it's challenging, especially as a writer who likes to think of themselves as being, eminently neutral. But we're not, of course. But another thing too to think about, and it occurred to me, this actually came up less on Hot Wheels, but more when we did a sports exhibit. That when you were talking about buying the costumes and the boas and the tuxedos and everything, but when I started selecting, we need football jerseys and baseball jerseys, and we need all these different things, and somebody in marketing would inevitably say, and cheerleader outfits, and I'd be like, yes, and cheerleader outfits, and they would say, because the girls need something to wear, and I'm like,
wow,
could you just back off just a little,
maybe and cheerleading outfits, because cheerleading is absolutely an athletic endeavor that both men and women and everyone
Yeah.
We
can do cheerleading
outfits too. So the boys can wear them if they want, but the assumption was unquestionably that the photo op would be boy in one of 6 sports jerseys, sister with pom-poms.
With pom-poms.
And it's frustrating to kind of feel like you're constantly pushing back against the sort of assumptions of the marketing department, and I'm sure there are many marketing departments who are plenty woke, but
so I have a question. Can I ask a question?
It's a question, but I might ignore it.
Okay, you could ignore it if you want. This is a little self-serving because most of the folks listening, and hopefully you guys know that I represent various folks in location-based entertainment, including museum content creators. And I have one client, I won't say too much, but his work has to do with dinosaurs and rethinking about their behavioral patterns, which actually a lot more female than we realize. And so I'm working with them to develop various programming things. And I'm wondering if you guys can coach me through when people are thinking of developing content for museums. Presumably some of the content is self-generated by the museums. You're funding and producing internally, right? Mm-hmm. And then some of the content you're sourcing from touring exhibitions. Mm-hmm. And so my question to you is, what is the appetite? And I know you can't speak for the total community at large, but maybe you could give me your thoughts. What's the appetite for this kind of programming where it's based on retelling stories with a different lens? Because there are so many stories based on fact, science, history that can be told truthfully just through a different lens. And I would think that that's a very compelling thing to do if we want to start exposing people to new ways of thinking. We can create content to do that, right? And so should content creators take those risks? Is there appetite for it? Is there a market for it? I'm just curious what your thoughts are in that regard.
Sarah, Cathy, do you mind if I hop in on this one briefly?
Yeah, you go right ahead.
You probably represent more than
you're like, please tackle this beast. So I'm going to build on 2 things that I think Sarah brought up earlier, which are actually no, Cathy may have as well. Museums are not neutral, and decolonization. Science museums in particular like to think that they don't have to engage in decolonization work because, hey, we don't have a collection that we stole from people. So why would we need to decolonize?
What does that mean, decolonize? Forgive my ignorance.
Okay, who wants to take that one, or shall I?
I can jump in. I'll make it quick. I'll make it quick. So the idea of decolonizing museums really comes from, natural history museums, art museums, places, again, like Cynthia said, that have collections, particularly anthropology collections and things like that, that have been effectively stolen from cultures that were colonized, right? So think, beautiful artifacts from Africa, beautiful artifacts from Asia, things like that. The work of decolonization is actually not just looking at those objects, but really thinking about the fact that as a museum, we are presenting these things as other and different and not us. And we need to engage with the history of colonization, suppression of other cultures, destruction of other cultures that has brought us to a current state. And I think to Cynthia's point about science museums, modern science is deeply colonial. And most of the things we've grown up learning about science, if you dig into all of those great people of science, is really not a pretty picture.
It's really not pretty at all. And science really has not, to a grand scale, had its reckoning moment about racism, about heteronormativity, about sexism. The amount of, why do Black people have worse outcomes from COVID? Let's talk about racism in medicine. Let's talk about racist assumptions that have been baked into medical education in this country for decades. Let's
talk about access to quality health care.
Let's talk about economic
red lines neighborhoods. Yeah.
Let's talk about economic disparity.
Let's talk about who has to work frontline jobs, stay open while the rest of us get to work from home.
And let's talk about why transgender individuals have worse mental health outcomes. Are you kidding me? Come on. And science really hasn't had that reckoning moment, which means there are, number one, some institutions that are doing the math, that are in this moment of, oh God, we really need to self-examine, and we need to start doing the work of making the science that we present more equitable, more inclusive, more honest. And those are the institutions that are potentially going to be more open to an exhibition concept, which is like, let's take apart some of the assumptions that have been the foundation of all of this area of science, of everything that we think about dinosaurs or Vikings in tombs or whatever you want to, mummies in a children's museum in Indianapolis, whatever you want to roll with there. But then there are also other institutions that are going to be like, science is truth, science is fact, it's unassailable. How dare you? How dare you, sir? And the trick is finding those institutions that are beginning to have that reckoning moment with how toxically racist, sexist, homophobic, transphobic, Islamophobic. The amount of great science out of Muslim countries that Western science has just ignored or disputed or been like, no, that's wrong and that's bullshit, whole cloth. Yeah, I mean, the institutions that are really starting to do that reckoning are the ones that are going to be open to presenting science a different way and presenting.
And frankly, a exhibit that you can rent that does that is a nice leapfrog for a lot of institutions that are struggling with how to turn 25-year-old permanent exhibits that haven't changed in a long time into something that better represents who they are now and want to be in the future. And so finding those exhibits that you can bring in to bridge while you're transforming other things is really important for a lot of places. So yes, keep going.
I would say this. If there's anyone out there in the museum community that makes financial decisions, what I'm witnessing is, and Cathy and Sarah, you tell me if I'm smoking something. I usually am, but tell me if I am now. I think what's happening in the location-based entertainment space, my view is that the line between a museum and an LBE experience is blurring, and museums, my hypothesis is they're going to start to get a run from their money from these non-museum experiences, and young people are really feeding that. They're feeding the demand for it. And I would say to museums out there, if you're not investing in content that is serving younger people and their stories and what the content that they want to see, you're going to lose market share to them. And so if you're a museum, I would really encourage you to start thinking about encouraging these touring companies who are creating these things, and, let them know there's demand for it. If they don't think there's demand, they're not going to invest in it. They can't, right? Because they're not going to believe that they have a place for this content. So, you know, I think museums have to really start investing in these things, because the non-museum world, in terms of these experiences and these environments, is going to give them a run for their money. That's just my 2 cents.
No,
So-
I would absolutely agree with that. I think we're already seeing that in a lot of ways. I think we've been seeing that play out for the last 5 years easily. You know, I think, you know, as a good museum person, I will say I always believe that there is something about museums that even some of these LBE experiences, when they are showcased at a museum, there is something different than when they're showcased in a convention hall or somewhere else. There's something about the authenticity of the space that I think changes things. I think where museums, I am seeing more and more, are getting on board, but I think some have lost their way, is in this space of, you know, but we're the best and they should just come to us and they should be so lucky. And, you know, that is really dated thinking. You know, we do compete with everything out there, and people's time is limited, their dollars are limited, their attention is limited. We need to be laser focused on both our mission and that guest satisfaction moment to make sure that people feel like we are a place for them and for all of them. Yes, exactly. If they don't find themselves, they're not going to engage.
Exactly. And if your board doubles down and doesn't let you as an institution engage in this work, people are going to call you out. You're gonna catch hell these days.
Yeah.
So, well, I guess the good news is, and maybe this is a good place to wrap up, is that market forces, you know, the beautiful thing about the generation gap in general is young people usually keep us on our toes. They really do. And I think that's what we're witnessing. And so, you know, the neat thing is, where we might be moving slower than we want, I think you guys, in terms of your positions and the work you're doing within the institutions in which you're working, demonstrate the fact that we are moving, right? We are moving. We may just not be moving as fast as we want, but we are moving. And young people, it's usually them driving it. And so I guess that's a good note to end on the last day of Pride Month, to talk about and just contemplate and be at one with how far we have come, and celebrate it, and celebrate the fact that we can celebrate it in a month that didn't exist 10 years ago, I don't think. And the marriage equality, its anniversary yesterday, the act, and think of how far, pardon me? Was it 26th? Think of how far we've come. And so anyhow, well, thank you guys for being on our show. Sarah, if history repeats itself, we'll be seeing you again.
I'm gonna message you guys after, because I have a thought about something else I'd love to talk about.
Yay! And Cathy, you know, it's like the mob.
Yeah,
you're in.
You're in.
You ain't going anywhere. We're probably gonna see
figure
you
something else
again.
Yeah,
An hour is not sufficient. But thank you guys. And Cynthia, it was good to see you. I've missed you.
Good to see you. I've missed you. And raise your glasses, y'all. UNC gave Nicole Hannah-Jones tenure while we were on the air.
Dog, are you kidding? God.
Okay, that's power of a collective, right? Power of social movements.
Yeah.
Yes.
Excellent. Well, it's coffee, but it's. I wish it had whiskey in it, so I'll just pretend. Anyhow, I'll pretend. You guys are in a time zone ahead of me, so that's the problem.
Yeah, it's definitely.
Anyhow,
it's beer o'clock here.
Mm-hmm.
Beer o'clock. I love it. And Kelsey and Anna, even though Anna, you had to dial out, but thanks to our producers extraordinaire, and thanks to everyone on TETV and our audience and everything. And we'll see you guys in a month. So,
bye, everyone.
Bye, guys.
Bye.
Thank you.